Romance still exists, of course, and romance readers make up a very large and active part of the reading public. But over the last couple of hundred years, realism is the genre that we say is ascendant because it has attracted writers to develop its conventions and experiment with them. So the second road to realism, you remember the first one was personal histories, where we have characters, we feel that we understand how they got to where they got to. The second road is consciousness. And this is where the assumption is that consciousness is primary. It's the place that human experience is real, rather than the outside world being the place where reality happens. We limit our scope to our own perception and watch how our minds develop reality from the stimulation that's impinging on our imaginary screen. Now, this philosophical sea change in how artists and intellectuals came to understand the world was not new, in the sense that Western culture has been split at the root for how to see reality. Aristotle assumed that something existed, whether you perceived it or not, and Plato thought that it was our mind's organized stimuli to produce the world that we see, because we couldn't see the world as it really was, only God could. So we saw the shadow of what the world was. And this has been that these two streams have existed since the beginning of Western culture, but it's in the last 100 years, 150 years, that it has become commonplace to think that we all have our own truths, rather than truth being something that our consciousness needs to recognize out in the world. Now, the modernists, being writers of the first half of the 20th century, looked at human consciousness as perceiving random and fluctuating stimuli, and then trying to organize it into something understandable within the mind. The focus was on the human mind and how the human mind did this, and that is where the experiments happened. Now, one major modernist was Virginia Woolf, and in her writing there's a little sense of integrated self. The mind is not an embodiment of virtues as it would be in romance, but it's fluctuating. So she would be more interested, rather than describe how the sun rose, she would describe how light crawled up a wall, and how that perception, that constantly changing and fluctuating perception, worked in a human mind. Another major modernist writer was James Joyce. Now, James Joyce was quite capable of writing what we would perceive as understandable realism, and did. But when he was experimenting with realism, he was looking into the human mind and trying to perceive how that mind worked to create a reality. So he wanted to see how he could represent human consciousness on a page in words. And one of his major experimental works was Ulysses. And what he was doing was sort of pretending that there would be a little person inside someone's mind recording what went through that person's mind that had to do with language. And the presumption is that we don't think in full sentences that, you know, make perfect connections from sentence to sentence, that we have all kinds of words and phrases, sometimes gibberish, that kind of flit across our screen, bump into each other as words. And so he wanted to write this down, and he did with Ulysses. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you have bits of sense that you can make out overall in it. He took the experiment to its logical end with Finnegan's Wake, which was the central consciousness is somebody who fell off a ladder and entered a dream state and woke up at his own wake. And it is just nonsensical. This is not a book that was meant to be read. It's the end of an experiment, basically, in this strain of realism, where you are trying to more or less pour out the experience of a mind onto a page, presuming that there's chaos going on in the mind as it strains to try to clump bits of experience together to make some kind of sense. Now, these were sort of more formal experiments, but there were technical things, innovations that were developed over the course of experimentation with realism that have survived today, and we would find seem very normal to us. And one would be stream of consciousness. Because the impetus was to try to get more and more inside the human mind, writers looked for ways to do that. The stream of consciousness is this idea that you can hear what someone's thinking and put that on a page without taking it to its endpoint the way Joyce did. But it still makes us feel like we are listening to what is going on in someone's mind. Another innovation was what we call free and direct discourse. And this was used more and more over the last couple of years for writers to give the impression to the reader that the reader is actually in the writer's mind, listening to what the character is thinking. So let's start with direct discourse, which is the farthest from the mind. That would be, "That flower is beautiful," she said. So "that flower is beautiful" has quotation marks around it, which means it's direct discourse, and the "she said" identifies who it is that is saying this or thinking this. Then to move it closer into our minds would be indirect discourse, and that would sound like this: "She thought the flower was beautiful." So the thought is being reported through a narrator, but there are no quotation marks around it. So we are that much closer into the character's mind. Now the breakthrough with free and direct discourse would sound like this: "What a beautiful flower." We're hearing, it's not being reported to us, it's not being quoted to us. We are inside that mind hearing the exclamation about the flower. So this brought the reader into the interior of the character's mind without focusing so stringently on how perception works, which is what Woolf was doing. So those are the high modernists, the first half of the 20th century. And then there was another innovation of modernism in the 60s that is referred to as postmodernism. And this is where writers took some of the premises of modernism and tweaked them in a new way. Specifically, as language became to be understood as a function of the mind rather than a representation of the world, postmodernists saw language as just kind of a game on the surface, that words bumped into each other and created meaning doing that, but there was not an expression of any kind of truth it was trying to get at, or representing the world in any kind of objective way. It became play. And this was represented in art by the Andy Warhol can of tomato soup. The idea that there's nothing deeper to art than just a can of soup. And so this was popular for among an elite set of readers. I mean, when you had the bifurcation of educated readers versus popular readers, the popular readers always loved the romances, as they do today. And the experimenters in realism would have been a far more academic group of people who would have been interested in that sort of thing. So apart from experimental writing, most writing has a general readership of people who recognize and enjoy the genre of realism that settled into a more understandable story about ordinary characters that have ordinary lives but are interesting in their own right, and they feel understandable and familiar to us. So where are we now in the development of genre? What has happened since realism has settled into that understanding? Well, that is the subject of my next and final webinar in this series.